Another question. Paul Earl?
I guess my question goes to all the panel members, really. It seems to me as I think about this Occupy movement and have spent, 30, 40 years thinking about society and injustice and so on, it seems to me that the issue of income inequality is secondary. It's a result rather than a first cause. And it strikes me that the real cause of income inequality is power inequality. Power inequality is where the problem lies, to me, not so much an income inequality. And I'm just wondering if any of the panelists have thought about it in those terms, and thought about if they find they agree with me at all, what would you do about power inequality? Because I'll just add one thought, and that is power inequality leads to income inequality, leads to power inequality, leads to income inequality, and so you end up in quite a vicious circle. So I wonder if any of the panelists have some reaction to that.
Does anyone want to speak to that? The role of power as underlying.
Shall I?
Please.
Since I've worked with power, I just remember engraved on my memory is a meeting with Ian Denham, who was the Minister for Technology, I believe, or maybe Industry. That's right, Industry under the Labour government. And he was talking about how you use government to make things happen. And he said, I spent my whole life trying to get my hands on the levers of power, only to find they weren't connected to anything. So that I think the real problem is that what you have in society is dysfunctional. People pursue aims which, as individuals, appear rational, but they have social consequences which are completely irrational. And this is now manifesting itself in a dysfunctional and irrational society. So it's true. I mean, why do people want lots of money? I used to ask my undergraduate students, what would you do if you had $1 million? And they said, I'd buy a yacht. And then, what would you do if you had 10 million? I'd buy a big yacht. And then you just bid up, and then you get to about 100 million, and they say, you know what, I'd get 2 big yachts. And you say, why? And they say, because all my friends would be impressed. I mean, it's just no longer about, you can't do anything with that much money. So it becomes about power. Yet, there's the myth of the, not the myth, the folk tale of the lonely rich man. What does that tell us? Money doesn't buy everything. If it really doesn't buy everything, why is it that people want so much of it? It's dysfunctional, it's irrational. They think it brings power, they think it brings distinction, they think it brings satisfaction. It doesn't, and that's spreading out from the individuals who are involved to the society as a whole, is what I think we're now seeing. So my answer would be, yes, they want it, but they don't get it.
Let me just offer one comment before I go over to Rick. One of the things I do remember from this Robert Reich book I alluded to earlier in the evening was the statistic he talked about in terms of the concentration of wealth. And what's interesting was his observation about what people with a lot of money do. And one of the things he observes is that their investment behaviors are different. They're not George Bailey who built Baileytown. You remember It's a Wonderful Life we're all going to watch this month? They typically speculate more, and they invest in really high-priced toys. Now, that's significant. Now, Alan's comment is also raising a really good question, and I know I've had a number of people, I've seen you here tonight, who have been in the MBA course in executive irresponsibilities, I almost said, in executive responsibilities. Where are you? Can you put your hands up? There's a number of people. One of the books that they've read in that course is called Money and the Meaning of Life. It's an interesting book. What does money mean for us? Something to think about if you're looking for a title to look further at. Rick, you had a question.
Yes, I think all the panelists have missed a key point from my world. It's called globalization. And let me give you some specifics. Manufacturing, we've seen all those jobs go offshore. China, go to Walmart, look at where everything is made. That is necessary for business. It's now going into the white-collar professional classes. Someone mentioned the Tata Group. May surprise you to know that right now in Winnipeg, there's 150 people from Tata working, doing IT application development. Those are jobs that are basically coming in at $30 an hour. And they're growing exponentially. There's radiologists now whose work is being outsourced to India, where you do the work overnight and it's turned around. And the radiologists may find, if the physicians' unions are not able to prevent it, that that's going to be the next wave. And I've been spending 42 years in the IT industry seeing this whole phenomena. So I would say, from my perspective, it comes down to one thing. You have to have the right skills in this marketplace to be able to be successful. And the right skills are those where you have interpersonal skills, you have business skills. Otherwise, you won't be able to compete, and you will become the disenfranchised because globalization is not going to stop. And none of you have mentioned that. And one more thing I would add. When I was driving into work the other day, the CBC was interviewing somebody from Memorial Park for the Occupy movement. It was a young woman, and she had had an undergraduate degree in anthropology. And she was complaining that all she can get is a job as a waitress. Did anyone ever tell her from the university or her high school to say, if you get an undergraduate degree in anthropology without going to a PhD to be a professor, you will not be able to get a good career? I'm sorry, but that's the way it is. Art, I know you've had to do this thing with globalization, where you move your manufacturing offshore. So I'd like the panelists to talk about that, because that is the here and now. That's not just theory. This is what's happening today.
Any comments from the panel on the global realities of the marketplace and what we can't go back to? In fact, before I call on my dean, who just leaned over as you were speaking and showed me his third point was globalization. So he's one step ahead of you. I'll ask the panelists if they have anything they'd like to contribute in terms of what Rick's mentioned.
I think what globalization has done is in part it's created some of the tools for this inequality to spread faster. And yet you go to certain societies where it has not done, has had a different impact. Germany certainly being a case in point, some other things. And I've spent a lot of time in Germany. One of the big things is their system of education and some of the values that are associated with that. So I think that the globalization is very real. And we're just talking to the professor earlier about the fact he's used my business case of Palliser Furniture, Mexico versus China. I think it's taught by almost every student in Canada that studies that case. What's interesting is today I am growing in Winnipeg and in Mexico, and I'm growing 40% in the US this year, taking business back from China. So China was an 8-year phenomenon, and one of the questions that I ask as a policymaker, do you destroy industries because China has an 8-year sort of spot advantage based on some particular artificial situations partly over there? So we lose an interest in industry, in many industries, because of a very short-term phenomenon. And that's another question. So that's a policy question. But yes, globalization, I think, allowed some of this thing to become more severe. But again, I point out not every society responded the same way. Some have dealt with it better than others. There is a policy choice.
Alan?
Yeah, I'm sort of quite unique. I'm probably one of 2 people in this room who think that globalization didn't exist. Okay? It's a synonym for something else. And the big thing that people forget is that what has been called globalization is accompanied by a massive growth in inequality between nations. This is something that I've specialized in researching. And from about 1980, from the sort of early era of liberalization up to about 2000, the ratio of the median income of the poorest to the richest nation doubled, trebled. I mean, the sort of inequalities we're talking about within our countries are as nothing compared with the inequalities we've seen worldwide. If it were not for that, people would not be offshoring. They're offshoring because they find labor whose income has been driven down to the stage where 1 billion people in the world today don't have enough to live on. I mean, we're talking about living wage in terms of supporting your family. They die, right? Now, end that and you finish the problem. And then I'm going to turn that around and say, I think actually in the future, I'm getting very kind of messianical here, but I think you're going to face a different problem, because I was in China a while back and I talked to a very eminent economist who I greatly respect called Henry K. Liu. New York-based, very good political connections in China. I advise everybody to read his stuff. It's all on the web. And he said that on his advice, he does tend to emphasize the advice he gives people, but in the Chinese Communist Party at its last conference adopted a plan which envisaged a 25% annual increase in wages in China for the next 5 years. I was also in Yaroslavl at the Global Policy Forum, which was the town where, I don't know if you remember, there was tragically a crash of the ice hockey team. We were actually having a meeting there at the time, and it was explained that the policy of United Russia, and I think this policy will be implemented despite the difficulties that party is in, was to increase state wage employees by 15% a year for the next 5 years. So those emerging economies are actually embarking on a strategy of raising wages, both deal with their domestic demand because they see they can't have export-led growth anymore, and also because of the social instability that they're frightened of in their own countries. Now, when that completes, and I think it's, there's I've had a lot of discussion with economists and people worldwide, and I think there's the beginnings of a consensus that that's a move. You are going to see the end of cheap labor worldwide. Then you're going to be complaining about something entirely different, which is all the stuff you go buy from China now for next to nothing is going to cost. And you know who's going to be paying for it most? Poor people. So you think poor people are angry now, you wait till stuff gets expensive. Then you'll see something.
Anyone else from the panel? Hari.
I'm going to address both Paul's question and your question together. Essentially what Paul said was that it is power inequality, not income inequality. And what you're saying is that it's globalization, not income inequality. The reason why I would like to look at it as income inequality is that we can look at other things that are influencing it for sure. But when we talk about income inequality, it is something that affects us. Something in which we have a role to play. We can take some action. It's individualized. Whereas power or globalization are some things that can be abstracted to something else. So we don't have to take action. So personally, I would like to kind of talk about being able to reflect on some of these issues and see if we can take one small step that can make a difference. So that is the way I was thinking about. And in terms of globalization, not all industries have responded in the same fashion. That's one of the things that, as Art was mentioning, the case that we talk about, is that they did not go to China, they did not develop that strategy, but they still are doing well, purely because their strategy was different. Right? So you need to have that clear strategy. So those are some of the thoughts that I have.
It's interesting, Thomas Friedman said the world is not flat, or the world is flat, I should say, and somebody else said it's not flat, it's bumpy. I think one of the things we can say is it is dynamic, and stay tuned. I mean, on the other side, some of these problems do not leave us off the hook, I would dare say. And I always remember one of my favorite one-liners is, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So our choices potentially, not even potentially, actually are significant. We're going to take one more question, then I'm going to call in our dean to offer his concluding remarks.
Yeah, it's actually more like a comment, because I think people talk about and I really like what you said, Hari. People talked about globalization, first of all, as it was something that was just happening, that was not being done by anybody, but I would seriously question that. But I think more to the point, I just want to come back. I mean, I think Art Defer mentioned that not all countries responded in the same way. Hari mentioned not all companies responded in the same way. And I think I would add one further thing to that, which is that globalization was used as a ruse to reduce wages in the West. It was basically, you argue that unless you bring your wages down, your jobs will go away. But, and of course, there's this trope, and of course, in reality, I agree, not as many jobs as you'd imagine have gone away. And in fact, if they've gone, they've more often gone in search of markets than they've gone in search of low wages. Further, one more thing. When the Japanese experienced the same phenomenon, which is that lower wage jobs migrated elsewhere, they actually developed a lovely metaphor for it, which helped them adapt, which was the flying geese metaphor, in which it was accepted that as Japan progressed, it would have to constantly retooled for higher skilled jobs, and that it was to be expected that the lower skilled jobs would go to the peripheral countries around Japan. And in fact, this has now developed several layers, so that, Korea is now shedding jobs, and so is China, in fact. Whereas we simply use it, in particularly in the English-speaking countries, to say, we should take wages down. And incidentally, Robert Reich, who Reg mentioned earlier, one of his earlier works, was the book called The Work of Nations, which effectively suggested the same sort of a strategy for the United States. And in fact, Clinton, in his first campaign, took this on board and made him Secretary of Labor and all those things. But somewhere along the way, this effectively productivist agenda, which all of you talked about, why production is important, a lot of this financial stuff is not productive, etc. This productivist agenda was jettisoned in favor of a purely financial agenda, and I think this is the important thing we have also to look at. So there are people who have had these ideas, the same ideas, for the United States and for other Western economies, but they have not been implemented, and I think this is important. At the end of the day, you don't want to keep Stone Age technology. You want to move up the technological ladder. That is what's called development. Development is precisely about raising wages, which then brings you to the odd situation where even third world countries were told, bring down your wages, take away your union regulations, and only then you'll get development, completely forgetting that development was precisely about raising wages. It was precisely about having good working conditions, etc. Thank you.
Thank you. That was Radhika Desai from Department of Political Studies at the U of M, and I just mentioned this because we're having a second conversation tomorrow at 2:30 in room 343 of the Drake Center, and you're more than welcome to continue the discussion then. Radhika will be on that panel, and thank you for setting the stage for what follows.